Alright guys, welcome back to APUSH curriculum, topic 7.6, World War I, Homefront. So in our last video we focused really on the military side of things and the political side of things. This time around we're going to look more at what's going on in America both during and shortly after World War I and how the war is really witness to some major changes in America. So let's jump right into this. We're looking at the causes and effects today of social changes during the World War I era. Notice I say era because some of the stuff we're going to talk about will extend a little bit beyond 1918 with the end of the war. So let's think about the war itself and think about a group of Americans who you might think would be probably reluctant to support this war effort. And if the thought was German Americans, well, you're right, because after all, we're at war with Germany, and there are literally millions and millions of German Americans. So, what can we say about German Americans during World War I? Well, it turns out that even though there was a paranoia about them, and there were lots of rumors that there was sabotage and spying going on, and that German Americans maybe couldn't be trusted during this time of war. It turned out a lot of that is false. And if you stop and think about it, remember German Americans had left Germany, so clearly they must be favoring a new country, America, and they wanted to prove their loyalty. They were Americans now, not Germans any longer. But again, there was a lot of anti-German hysteria. There were even acts of violence. You can see the picture at the bottom there. The German American who was tarred and feathered. And in fact, there was even one German American who happened to be a socialist as well, named Robert Prager, who in fact was lynched by a group of Americans who were looking for someone German to punish, I guess. And sadly, even though they murdered this man, they were all, the perpetrators of this, they were all acquitted at trial. And so again, you can kind of see that the anti-German feeling in this cartoon. And the hysteria really goes into areas that, in retrospect, seem, well, frankly, ridiculous. There were the German language. Most schools stopped teaching it. German language books were taken out of libraries. Sometimes even just books that had been translated into English but were by German authors, they were sometimes thrown out and burned. German place names were often changed, towns, street names, and then even some German Americans changed their last name as well. And then things that have a German sound to them, things like sauerkraut, that's of course a German word, people started calling it Liberty cabbage. Hamburger became Liberty steak, and dachshunds became Liberty dogs. Now, you might think that sounds pretty ridiculous, and it is. But there was something kind of similar to this in the early 2000s. So the context for this is in 2003, America was preparing to invade Iraq. And this was an invasion that was pretty controversial. A lot of European countries were a little skeptical of this war and urging America to kind of show some restraint. France in particular was critical of the war, and so things called like French fries were renamed, at least temporarily anyways, with freedom fries instead, which again is pretty silly. Okay, now let's talk about some laws, laws designed to, in theory anyways, protect the American war effort and try to clamp down on any dissent. Remember, not everybody was in favor of this war. Not only was the declaration of war not unanimous, there was a sizable number of Americans who they wanted nothing to do with this war, particularly among radical socialists and even communists in America. They felt that this war was a war to protect capitalism and imperialism, excuse me, and they were dead set against it. So some of them, made very inflammatory speeches against the war effort and so forth. And this results in two laws. One's called the Espionage Act, and one was called the Sedition Act, which were were passed in 1917 and 18 respectively. And basically what it set up is this a penalty for obstructing the war effort or making disloyal remarks about the U.S. government. And in its prosecution, these laws are often used to target people that were already politically unpopular. So socialists, communists, union leaders were often aggressively prosecuted under these laws. A good example of this would be the Radical Labor Union, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, also known as the Wobblies. That was the nickname of the IWW. They're going to be targeted during World War I. All right, now you might be thinking to yourself, shouldn't the First Amendment protect you against being prosecuted for simply stating that you're against the war? Well, you would think so, but in fact, in 1919, the Supreme Court, in a court case named Schenck versus United States, said, well, not so fast. Their argument was, the Supreme Court's argument was, that freedom of speech can in fact be revoked and limited when such speech poses, and this is their phrase, a clear and present danger to the nation. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that clear and present danger is very, very subjective. It's, you know, one person's clear and present danger wouldn't be somebody else's. So this is really kind of a strike against free speech during the war. All right, well, let's move on now and look at something called the Red Scare. There are two Red Scares in American history. This is the first. The second will take place in the 1950s. And red, of course, is just a reference to communism. So let's try to understand why there was such a fear of communism during and shortly after World War I. One of the reasons would be, of course, that during World War I, Russia underwent a revolution, a Bolshevik revolution. The Bolsheviks were Russian communists. And all of a sudden, the biggest country on planet Earth was a communist country. And a lot of people feared that such a thing could potentially spread and maybe even make it to America. And then there was also a series of strikes during and after the war. And a lot of people thought, well, hey, maybe this is like the start of a communist revolution. So there was a lot of anxiety and fear, and maybe you could even call paranoia about communism in America during and after the war. And people just really did not want to see America go down that path. And you can see this political cartoon speaking of that path. You know, their argument is it starts with labor unions, they go on strike, it leads to chaos and riots, and before you know it, it's a full-fledged revolution, and communism is here. So to prevent that, our Attorney General at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer, is going to aggressively try to restrict radicalization and the spread of communist and socialist messages. And famously, he is going to lead these things called the Palmer Raids, named, of course, for him, where some 6,000 people were rounded up, many of whom were immigrants, and quite a few of them actually deported, kicked out of the country because of their radical beliefs. Now, there were some like genuine bad guys within this movement. There were some violent anarchists in America, but you know, the Palmer Raids, I think in many ways were kind of overkill, that there were a lot of people who may have just been on the left end of the political spectrum who were kind of lumped in with some really nasty characters. In retaliation for this, an anarchist bombed A. Mitchell Palmer's house in 1919. Now, he was not harmed. In fact, nobody except for the bomber himself was harmed. We think, based on the evidence kind of left behind, that the bomb basically blew up unexpectedly, prematurely, and the bomber himself was killed. And you can see some physical damage, but that's about it. But it does, I mean, that's a pretty scary thing, right? A member of the cabinet here being targeted for an explosion. Speaking of explosions, shortly after the war, in September of 1920, there was a bomb on Wall Street, and this killed 38 people, hundreds others were wounded, and no one was ever actually arrested or convicted for this crime. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries in American history, but the fact that they targeted Wall Street, which is, of course, synonymous with banking and capitalism and all that, certainly suggests that these people were radical anarchists or communists or something along those lines. Some physical damage here still on Wall Street today, a remnant of this explosion. All right, now we're going to look at how people are moving because of the war. We're going to take a look at a mass migration. So with the need for massive war production comes the creation of many, many jobs. And so factories are hiring people left and right. Many people are moving to the cities for those factory jobs. Women are playing a pretty big role in some of these factories, replacing a lot of men who are off fighting the war. And it's this attractiveness of war work is going to lead to something called the Great Migration. And this is something we kind of hinted at in period 6, how we were talking about how African Americans were, during the Gilded Age, were starting to leave the Deep South in fairly decent numbers. Well, that's going to accelerate. In fact, you might even say explode during World War I. It's a great migration in terms of great number of people. Now, why were they moving from the South? Again, it's a lot of the same reasons we looked at in period 6. It's trying to escape Jim Crow segregation and repression. It's also the plentiful jobs that were available in places like Detroit, Chicago, New York, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, those kind of areas. And so there's economic opportunities. However, it turns out the North was not super inviting. And even though racial segregation was not at the same level as you would see in the Deep South, it wasn't as ingrained, not all Northerners were happy to see this influx of Black Americans into their cities and into their towns and into their neighborhoods. And in July of 1917, in fact, in East St. Louis, which is actually just across the river in Illinois, there was a race riot that left 9 whites and 40 blacks dead. So this is, think about this. This is in the context of World War I. We're trying to fight the Germans on one hand. On the other hand, we're literally tearing each other apart at home. That's pretty scary stuff, pretty awful stuff, honestly. And the headlines here are just really concerning. Burned, clubbed to death, manhunting. It's awful, awful stuff. And those riots are going to expand. They're not going to end in 1917. 1919 actually was kind of the peak of these things, right after the end of World War I. It's known as the Red Summer. And you can see there's riots and lynchings and chaos all across America. Probably the most notorious example of this came in Chicago in 1919. Chicago was the second biggest city in America. It was a city that was growing rapidly. Lots of Black Americans moving up from the South to look for these war jobs. Some of them actually took jobs as strike breakers during strikes, and so there's a lot of tension growing in Chicago. Many white neighborhoods were frankly very concerned that their neighborhoods was starting to have Black residents in them, and the final straw that breaks the camel's back comes in the hot summer of 1919, when there were some Black swimmers on Lake Michigan, and they were they swam and they left the designated zone for Black Americans, and they went into the white zone, if you will, along the beach. And some white people started throwing rocks at the swimmers, and one of them actually drowned. And this is going to set off, an explosion of violence, in which for 2 weeks the city's being torn apart, and literally dozens of people are killed in these riots. And you can see just a couple pictures here of the damage and the human cost of these riots. All right, so that is it for our discussion of World War I, and topic 7.5 we covered, or excuse me, 7.6 rather, we covered the home front, and now we're kind of done with World War I, and it's time to start thinking about the 1920s and see what's going on and how America is changing in that decade.